Okay, welcome to the September Grafana Agent Community Call. Today we've got a few things on the agenda, including a presentation on Kubernetes and using the agent with modules. So very excited to see how that goes. We've also got a couple proposals if we have time at the end that we will take a look at. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to post them in the chat. This will be up on YouTube. So wherever you're watching, welcome. With that, we'll give a quick chance if anybody does have any questions that they've come here with that they want to hit on. Give a brief second here if you want to post any in the chat or just unmute and fire away. Okay, nobody jumps, so no problem. We'll jump right into Aaron if you have any as he's talking or about anything in general that you think of. Again, feel free to post it. So we'd like to welcome Aaron today, who's solution architect at Grafana, who's going to talk a bit about what he does with Kubernetes and the agent and modules. So go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks, Eric. My name is Aaron Benton. I am a senior solutions architect on the professional services team here at Grafana. And today I just want to take a little bit of time and cover some of the different approaches that we've taken on the professional services team in terms of how to get the most out of the agent, how to get the most out of your observability stack as efficiently as possible with as little amount of code as possible, so to speak. And in the metrics world, you probably are familiar with there's an annotation, namespace, if you will, of Prometheus.io, /scrape, port, path, etc. So when I first started writing a config for that, I did it with the agent static mode and started to expand on that as the use cases that I was coming across needed to have more extensibility or more control over what a user wanted to scrape or ingest. A perfect example is a tenant. Many of the customers that I would work with are deploying Mimir or Jim with multiple tenants and wanted to simply be able to control which tenant a metric went to or a scrape went to as a result of just setting an annotation. So started kind of exploring that. I'm going to share my screen here, and there is not any make sure it's on the right one. Should see Visual Studio here, hopefully.
Yeah, looks good, Aaron.
Cool. So I'm going to just start out and go through a little bit of this config in static mode before we switch over to flow, just so you kind of get an idea of how awesome it is that I was able to port this over to flow and all that's out there and to be able to be used. So with metrics, I have my I have my different jobs, etc. I'm going to skip through all the normal Kubernetes type of things, because one of the main things that you want to be able to do is not just monitor Kubernetes, right? You want to get metrics about your applications, or other open source technologies that you're deploying. Like, it's not just about Kubernetes metrics. And this is my opinion only. I'm not a fan of using things like a service monitor or a pod monitor or a probe, simply because that the more service monitors, pod monitors, probes, whatever that are deployed, that's more service discovery requests that are happening against the Kubernetes API. It's unbounded. I would rather have a single set that says discover all of the endpoints or all of the services or whatever as a single job, and go from there. And we can have a debate about that. I'm happy to discuss that further. But anyway, in this particular config, we have added support for these various different annotations. Along with the Prometheus.io ones, we've also extended a metrics.agent.grafana.com / operation, type annotation. So in here, I have one for endpoints, we're doing all of these different things as part of discovery relabelings, setting things like a, deployment label, etc., which is very useful, because we can take the same approach if I look at my logs. So this is the next kind of evolution of this is, I said, well, if I'm using annotations for metrics, why can't I use them for my logs? And this really opened up a lot of possibilities in terms of controlling my logs. I didn't have to go in and write custom, Promtail pipeline stages for each different use case. I could simply expose annotations that allowed a developer, SRE, whomever, to control the behavior of their logs. I was no more sending the entirety of the logs. As an example, the default Promtail configuration literally had like one stage in there, and it said CRI, I think, or Docker, and that was it. Just parse the log line as it is and send everything. Well, what if a developer leaves debug mode on, right? Do you need to ingest all of your debug logs or trace level logs? In my opinion, is no. Right? If debug mode is on, then you're most likely troubleshooting some type of issue. You're viewing the pod logs directly on the pod, whatever the case may be. You don't need to send those logs to Loki for storage, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud, right? Save that money, so to speak. Or things like, in my opinion, a label of level should be associated with every single log. I see it all the time where someone will be searching for, they'll do a specific set of labels, right? In namespace, whatever, and they'll look for a specific error message. Well, an error log level probably represents less than 0.5% of the overall log volume. Why would you want to search through all the info logs for a specific error? Like, you can just disregard all the info level logs by specifying a level of error in this case. So there's a lot of different annotations on here. I'm going to go over some of those more in detail. But what I wanted to start with was, this is a very lengthy configuration. So there's jobs for auto scraping, jobs for pods, or for endpoints, for probes even are also all supported. We do probes for services and ingresses. When you start to look through this config, it does not get any smaller. And it could actually be even more, 3-4 times larger than this, simply because, if you're not familiar, this star is YAML anchors. It's basically the expansion of an anchor. So up above, this is where an anchor is defined. I tried to not repeat myself throughout this particular, configuration in static mode. That's a fairly lengthy file, right? And YAML anchors is the best that you can do with trying to reuse those components. If I was to look at this logs config in static mode, again, with all of these different annotations that we're supporting, that ends up being, 1,000-line configuration. And that's just for one tenant. The config has to be repeated per tenant. Although when you're adding another tenant, this is what it would look like with the YAML anchors. So not a lot of extra code to add more tenants. But we have all of the different, stages. If this is your log format's klog, we're doing this, all of these things. I can't pick and choose. If I'm sharing this config, with a customer working on a deployment of Grafana agent, we have to review this config basically line by line, and they might say, well, I'm not using Postgres. So I would just say, well, delete that block, right? Or delete this block or delete that block. This is where flow comes in. So for metrics, in this case, this is my config. I mean, I'm actually, this agent is sending metrics for 2 tenants and an on-prem, or self-managed Grafana Enterprise metrics deployment. And then I'm also sending the metrics to Grafana Cloud. And I was able to do that through 67 lines versus 1,200 lines or whatever that was before. And don't get me wrong, all that code still exists. With Flow, we were able to port that to modules. And there is a publicly available modules repository. So Grafana agent modules. In this case, the modules that we'll be talking about today fall under the modules Kubernetes directory, and you're going to see 3 folders there. And each one of these annotations are described, and again, greater detail about what they do. I'll probably kind of switch back and forth between these as we talk about them, just to try to trigger thoughts or approaches, use cases that you might have for something like this. The first one I mentioned about controlling behavior. I want to talk about these 2, which is scrub nulls or scrub empties. Prior to joining Grafana, I spent about 5 years at Couchbase as a principal solutions architect in the NoSQL world, dealing with JSON. And I used to say this all the time. JSON is great because it's a flexible schema, right? The schema is literally stored next to the value. But JSON is not an efficient storage mechanism because the schema is stored next to the value, right? Those are extra bytes. And I'll use Istio as an example. Many of you are probably using Istio. If you're using Istio JSON logging, it will log a consistent JSON model, whether or not it has a value. It will still write the schema and, whatever, prop, null. Doesn't do you any good at all to store that. Why waste the bytes? And for one customer that was using Istio, their average message size was 660 bytes. When we set this annotation, that removing all of the null values, that reduced the message size to 350 bytes, right? Almost a 50% reduction in size. Well, that reduced their total cost of ownership, right? They were able to get the same information by sending a lot less information, filtering it at the edge, so to speak, through Grafana agent. Same thing, concept with scrubbing nulls would be to remove empty values, things like an empty string or an empty object or an empty array. Remove those things because you don't need the schema. Like, you can save the bytes that are associated with it. Right? Other ones, so there's a couple other scrubbing ones on here that I think are worth mentioning as well, which is scrubbing of the timestamp. If you look at your logs in Explore or whatever, have you ever noticed that there's 2 timestamps there? One of them is the metadata timestamp of when the timestamp or the log was captured, and that's what is displayed. However, everyone with the logs, obviously, like, you're writing a timestamp to the log line itself. That can be redundant, essentially. So this annotation of scrubbing the timestamp actually removes the timestamp from the log line itself. And depending on what timestamp format you were using, that can, save another 20, 30 bytes. Doesn't seem like a lot, but you do a couple 100 billion log messages a month, that can be some significant savings. And taking it even further is the log level. Again, we want to extract the log level. We want to make it a label. These modules do that either by you specifying a log format and we know where to extract it at, or a best effort that we can kind of dive into in terms of those regular expressions. If you wanted to, you could remove the log level. The default behavior is to leave everything as it is. And that's what I really like about this annotation-based approach to logging and metrics, is you're opting in to the behavior. So we want to ingest all the logs exactly as they are. If you want to enhance them more, we do that. Including things like dropping the log levels. Like if you want to remove debug, the default for this is to drop debug. If you had a use case you needed to keep debug, set the annotation to false, and we would retain that message, type of thing. Then there might be use cases when you want to do masking, right? Where you set annotation, we look for an SSN or a credit card or email address, whatever the case may be, we can mask that value directly within the logs. If you don't want that behavior, the beauty of the module-based approach is don't include that module, right? So let's take a look at what I mean by there. So in my particular config for logs, I'm simply referencing the publicly available agent modules repository and giving it a path. I just called it all.river. Naming things is hard. I'm sure that's one thing we all can agree on. So for all.river, this is what that config does. It has different arguments. Then I'm actually just including another module to say, get the targets, right? This one is logs from worker. So under targets, there is actually two. This one here, logs from API, uses the Kubernetes API directly. So when you are deploying an agent, the logs agent should be a daemon set. If you are getting the pod logs from the worker, if you are getting the pod logs from the API, that should be a stateful set. Otherwise, you will end up with n number of logs if you deployed it as a daemon set, n number of workers. The getting logs from API is currently, someone from the agent team can correct me. I don't know if it's marked as experimental or beta, but it is not a GA thing yet. Is that correct, Eric?
I gotta check the docs. Which one was it?
The Loki source Kubernetes. I believe it is still marked as experimental or beta.
Yeah, it has an existing bug in the Kubernetes where it's sometimes hard to unhook itself.
Yeah, the main reason that you would consider using the API one, obviously it's less pods, but you don't have to have a privileged container or privileged access in that case, which some of you may have a need for. It is obviously going to use more, CPU network type of things to process all those because it's making HTTP calls. But usually, I'm going to always default to getting logs directly from the worker, deploying it as a daemon set. All right. So coming back to the all, that's how I get my targets. And if we actually treat this out, so we go from all to worker, there's another module in here that's applying logs relabelings. Right? So in here, and that actually includes another module. So every bit of that code from that static config was actually broken up into multiple separate modules, right? And even including here, you're seeing the path modules, Kubernetes relabelings common. Well, if we look at this tree, I have logs and I have metrics, and then there's relabelings. The cool thing is these relabelings are actually shared across my metrics and my logs because service discovery is the same. Doesn't matter. So now I'm able to follow or create more reusable, components. I'm not going to sit here and walk through the tree for each one of those things. If you've used the Grafana agent UI, or I guess if you weren't aware, there is a UI for the agent. I'll just put mine over here. So pods. I don't know, I'm just going to jump into one of these. And I'm going to put the agent team on the spot. Sorry. There's a super useful graph here you can zoom in and out on and see the whole tree of everything. And currently with modules, it doesn't draw the whole tree. I'm sure that's on the roadmap of things, but that would be awesome.
One day.
Yeah, I think we're aware the UI experience for modules needs an upgrade. Yeah,
but no, this is incredibly useful. Even if you're testing modules, just to see how everything is connected, like viewing that graph, getting a visualization of what's there, etc. I can see, even though there's only these modules on here, I know what's going on. I can see the health of them. Obviously, like we can come back here and I could drill in to each one of these things, see what's going on, what arguments are being passed around, what's exported, all that. Extremely useful. But coming back to the config, doing a bunch of relabelings, applying, you're determining like the container runtime. So this allows me to choose how I want to parse the logs by simply determining the container runtime dynamically. You no longer have to say it has to be Docker or it has to be CRI. I handle that for you in a module, simply because I'm adding a relabeling of the container runtime that gets set. And then right here, we choose if it's container D, I'm going to use CRI. If it is Docker, I'm going to use Docker. You don't have to declare that anymore. We just determine it using a match stage. So kind of useful there, saves a little bit of time on determining how we want to do that. So after we get the targets, then we have all these other modules, right? There's a log formats all. These are all the log formats that we've initially added support for. Are they going to be 100% accurate? No, because every language you could change whatever format you want, etc. I think this is more outside of well-structured ones like log FMT or JSON as an example, or probably even klog could be thrown in there. If you have some custom format, you would need to update that accordingly to handle it. But I'm going to just pick this one here. It's a generic JSON. All we're doing is saying, did you set the annotation of logs@grafana.com log format, generic JSON, and we're matching a pattern to make sure that it is actually a JSON object. If it is, then we there's a label for log type that gets set, and we'll talk about that. You can drop those if you want. We try to dynamically determine the label or the level, I'm sorry, by using the JME's path expression. Basically just putting a bunch of ors in here off of things that I've seen from different use cases that may be there. So we set the level, checks to see if you're setting a timestamp, and if you are, we're going to essentially drop that property from the JSON object. And then this is around, do we want to scrub the level or not? And for the other scrubbing, I would say, or not other scrubbings, but when you go through here, this defaults the log level, so it ensures that there's always one set. If the can't determine the default log level, then, so if the log level is still unknown, we look to see if it's in a Klog format. If it is, we set this. Otherwise, this is the regular expression for a best effort to determine the log level. But regardless, a log level of unknown is used. The reason we do that, then you can write a logql selector to say, show me all the ones that are unknown. Go address those. If you need to update the formatting or the module, add a new module to detect that particular type, set the log level, you can do that. This is for all of our scrubbing. And then we run into this one here, which I'm going to come back to here in just a second. At the very end, one of the last modules is label keep. Okay. This is just the list of labels, but it's an argument. You can obviously change what you want to keep. Notice on here, there is not a label for pod. Pod is a very high cardinality label. I'm not a fan of using pod as a label. I take a different approach to determining what that is. So I'm going to see if I can find this real quick. Yeah. So in my relabelings common, I'm actually creating a label called deployment. Again, naming things is hard, whatever. But the deployment label in this case, if my pod was named, Grafana agent, this is obviously from a daemon set, it would be, the deployment label would be set as daemon set / Grafana agent, friendly name, right? If it is a replica set, either one of these patterns, then it's simply going to become replica set / friendly name. If it's a stateful set / friendly name, that's on there. So why do we do that? This reduces the cardinality of a given label. So if I was to show you here from Grafana Cloud, I'm going to pick, deployment. These are the different values that are set or available, I should say, as part of the deployment label. Reduces cardinality, right? You have a daemon set. If you're adding worker nodes, whatever, you're constantly adding, pods are getting added. Or if you have a replica set, you're doing multiple deployments throughout a day, those pod names are changing. That's increasing the cardinality. And I would be absolutely shocked if someone said, yeah, I know what all of my pod names are, especially in a replica set. No, that's not the case. Nobody uses the pod label outside of what I would call an edge case or non-normal activity, meaning you're troubleshooting something and you truly needed to know the name of the pod. Don't add that as a label. Loki is going to be far more performant. That's by not having that as a label and essentially grouping all of the logs from all of the pods under the same stream. That ends up being more efficient, right? Because that's ultimately what you would be searching for to begin with. Is I want to find this message or look at the aggregate of all of my pods to begin with. Of what is my error rate or what is my bytes per second, whatever. You don't care about the pod. You're already eliminating that off when you're performing that aggregation to begin with. So don't use it, right? Very useful. However, again, I understand there's the edge case to find the pods. And
let me jump in for a second. And there's a question in the chat that I want to direct you to. So Jonathan asked, he said, given the recent updates to Loki for structured metadata, they recommend not using that many labels due to the overhead of querying that many log streams, right?
Yes. So the structured metadata, I know that there's enhancements being made and work being done around there. I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about or not on there, so I would probably defer that to the public Grafana Slack and the Loki team there to get more details on what they're currently working on, what may be coming, and then the roadmap. But I am hesitant to say because I don't know what I am allowed to say or not in terms of what's coming there. But the question with labels, I think, is always something that's confusing with Loki. So I'm going to detract just for a minute here. You'll hear the term high cardinality a lot, and in a relational database, if you're creating an index on a username field, high cardinality is great. Right? That means you then use selectivity. Selectivity is a way to measure the variation of the data, the uniqueness. So 100% selectivity is awesome, right? It means with a B tree style index, you should get the same performance whether you have 1 million records or 100 million records, roughly. With Loki and LogQL selectors, you don't want high cardinality, but you don't want low cardinality. You want a balance. And I think the easiest way to describe it would be if all queries targeting those logs, if you're considering adding a label, if all queries targeting those logs would use that label 90% of the time, then yes, add that label. If it would be 10% of the time, do not add that label. Is kind of the easiest way to think about that. It's not that high cardinality in Loki is a bad thing. High cardinality in Loki is a bad thing when the label is not used. That's the key. For example, if you were writing logs and you wanted to add a customer around orders, as an example, you wanted to have a label for the customer ID. If you were always going to specify the customer ID in every query, absolutely add that label. It's going to be insanely fast. But the moment you try to query those logs and don't specify that customer ID, the query performance is going to plummet. It's going to be awful. That's the trick. Yeah, and Jonathan, I'm not necessarily familiar with what they've called out with log level or what you should add in, structured metadata and those types of things. And everybody has different use cases. And I would say, in my experience, at least with customers, the log QL queries that they are writing are almost always targeting a specific level. And I've always recommended that. And they've gotten great performance by filtering on that. And so again, this is what we're kind of covering here is just an annotation-based approach by leveraging modules. And the cool thing with modules is you can fork this repository. You can make whatever changes you want to it. You can create your own modules or copy all of these and then edit them, in your own, private Git repo. You can use a combination of both. I think the main thing here is just showing the power of modules. And Eric or Matt can correct me because they looked at the PRs, but I think there's like 80 some modules that were added in here that you can kind of pick and choose from in terms of an approach. And there is a couple examples up here, like for logs, if you want to specify your own log formats. Like this is just showing, but the config now flows, so to speak, very nice by saying, I'm going from this module to this module to this module. You don't necessarily care about all of the bits or the details that are happening, inside of there, right? And as part of what we do with this particular config is we actually take all of the pod labels and all of the pod annotations, and we make them labels in the how do I say it? We make them eligible to be labels in Loki by exposing them as labels to the Promtail pipeline stages. That's why the very last stage that I will always have is a label keep, that regardless of whatever came through the pipeline, these are the only labels that I'm going to allow to ultimately be created no matter what. So I guess jumping back over one of the very last modules that that's in here. In this example, I'm just doing 2 tenants. But there's also a module for the kubelet journal logs, so the system D logs. In this case, you can basically retrieve I think the default is all whatever system unit files are there, return those logs, but you can filter them. So in my case, again, these would fall under, what did I call it? Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's Loki source journal kubelet. So this obviously is just like a play cluster, whatever. These are the different system unit files that I have log messages for. Kind of funny, you know, I could look at SSHD and obviously see that people are regularly trying to connect in here for that. But primarily you would use this for, like, you know, it's beneficial tying it with your Kubernetes logs, with the kubelet service or containerd services when you're trying to associate those with Kubernetes. And for logs as well, or Kubernetes in general, and this was part of the Grafana Cloud Kubernetes integration, is Kubernetes events. So if I popped over to Kubernetes integration there, I don't know, I'm just going to do like dashboards, whatever. I haven't done a lot lately, so I might have to go back a little bit. Yeah. Very powerful feature, obviously, if you might be aware, but annotations. And there is this dashboard and several of the others, there's annotations to show the events that are coming in, which means we need to collect the Kubernetes events as logs. What I typically do, for me, I would deploy at least, in this example, 3 types of agents. I would deploy a metrics agent, I would deploy a logs agent, and then I would deploy a separate events agent. The main reason that I do events separately is metrics is a stateful set, logs is a daemon set, and I would do events as a stateful set. I think in a lot of examples, you would see events coming or coupled with metrics as the stateful set. Reason I like to do it is kind of twofold: separation of duties, and the metrics, you can cluster metrics, right? In static mode, that would be, you know, hash mod sharding, things like that. In Flow, there is a clustering component. I believe that feature is currently marked as beta. The modules that are defined in that repository actually do support clustering. The default behavior is false, but that does work. But again, I know that is marked as beta and, you know, could be subject to change. Essentially, each Prometheus component requires, or each Prometheus scrape job requires the setting of that cluster variable, but essentially you just pass it in one time to the module, and that is passed to all the subsequent scrape jobs, and works fantastic. So that's the other reason why I would deploy events separately from metrics, is if you started clustering your metrics agents, and you have 3 agents as an example, if events was on there, events is not clusterable. So you're going to end up with 3x the number of events in that case. So I like to keep those separately. And Flow does allow you to perform rewrites now on the events, which is extremely useful. So, from an events standpoint, there's probably not too many in here now, but you can take a look. So we can see I've added, or I should say, like extracted a component. Component, if we looked in here, is actually coming from source component. I could make that source component. I was just already using a label of component by looking for that label or annotation being set on pods. So like what app.kubernetes.io/component, or if it was just component. There's a lot of those type of things in the modules where it looks for multiples. Kubernetes IO, not that one, probably this one. So in the common relabelings, we're looking for app. In this case, we would do name or Kate's app or app, and we just grab the first one that's found. And same thing kind of for component. We would look at these different places. So either app Kubernetes IO component or just components. And because of how labels work, etc., it doesn't matter which one this came from because it's consumed from a separate module, separate scrape job. So the last annotation I would say to mention real quick as well that is supported, so along with all the logs and the metrics, is probe-based annotations. So we do support the Prometheus IO probe, but there is some additional ones as well. So we're supporting probes agent grafana.com/probe. There's annotations as well. I've kind of found that different dashboards or rule mix-ins, or even some of the integration in Grafana Cloud rely on a very specific job name. When you're doing auto scraping, that can be difficult to match. So there is an annotation that you can set on probes, logs, or metrics /job to just declare the name of the job that you wanted the metrics collected from this whatever entity to be set. So that's on there as well. And yeah, I think we have about 15 minutes left or so. And this is more, again, just wanting to show you the possibilities that are there, how you can take this gigantic static config, break it up into reusable components. In my case, I'm using module.get, but there is module.file, module.http, module.string. The nice thing with Git is you can set the poll frequency of how often you want it to go do that. So you don't even have to worry about deploying anything. It can just go pull it from your Git repository directly. But I wanted to kind of leave time for questions or feedback, thoughts. Matt?
Is there like a prescribed easy, are all the defaults pretty same? Like if I just wanted to run this on a Kate's cluster and not really have to think too much, is it kind of set up for that, or what's the easy way to get started here?
Yeah, so basically for each one, metrics and logs in this case, there's just an all file, and that includes everything with all the defaults set. There is a few arguments that I've seen that are common, like a label for cluster, environment, region that you might want to add. These essentially, there's not a way, at least that I could determine, to make that like a dictionary, at least that I could get to work. But I just add those type of things as like external labels through the right. But Mainly, yeah, there's sane defaults for all of those. Even like the file name, Promtail always creates a label for the file name that was tailed. That can be very, very unique. And again, the goal here is to reduce the cardinality. So if this is your, file name, this is namespace, and then pod name, container ID, container, and number of rotations, we go ahead and just rename that file. So if you did decide to keep the file name label, we're removing the uniqueness, just setting it up for better performance out of the beginning. But yeah, everything is kind of sane by default. The only thing I guess you could maybe consider not sane is the default for dropping debug and trace level messages is true. But you can easily add the annotation to keep those if you wanted. But yeah, all the other behavior that we've talked about, like scrubbing things, removing them from there, is you have to opt in to that behavior. So yeah.
Cool.
And for metrics, all of the jobs for metrics do line up with the Grafana Cloud integrations. So you can see, like, on a lot of these, whether it's Cube API server, like we're setting that exact name. However, if you didn't want to use the Grafana Cloud integrations for that, then you're using a different mix-in or project dashboard, whatever, you can change the name of that job label again for those. So all these try to have match exactly what is coming from Grafana Cloud and going from there. Metrics wise, the only thing I would say to call out is there is these scrape jobs for auto scraping of endpoints and auto scraping of pods, but you'll notice in here the only auto scraping for metrics that is included by default is for endpoints and probes for services and ingresses, and not pods. This is, I mean, you can debate this if you want. My opinion, or kind of default that I've always gone with, is to use endpoints for scraping of metrics. And this is due to if you just read the documentation for service discovery, this last two blocks here. If the endpoint belongs to a service, the role of all of the labels for service are attached. If it's backed by a pod, all the labels from the pod are also attached. So endpoint, for the most part, gets you the best of both worlds. This way, I can also add the name of the service automatically as a label for the metrics. You could do both, but I would say from what I've seen, for the most part, a spray and pray approach sometimes is taken with annotations, and a developer, SRE, whomever, might add the scrape annotation to the service, and which gets added to the endpoints, and then also add it to the pods. And if you have both of those set, and you were scraping both auto scraping endpoints and auto scraping pods, you would end up with redundant metrics. And they would truly be two different series as well, because endpoints would have an additional label of service that it came from, and pod would not. So, good question. Any other questions from anyone else on the call? Concerns or feedback? Craig?
Number one, this is really, really amazing. I think this is an amazing place to start, and we should do more work to promote this as something for people to look at. My question for you is mainly, are there features you wish Flow had to make it easier to lay out these modules, to make them more configurable? Or like, are there any pain points you particularly had?
A couple, I guess you could say. Most of it was just simple things. I would say, like with the river language, if I'm defining a multi-line array, and while you should, yes, always have a trailing comma on the last one, I have a JavaScript background, makes sense. River, it fails if there's not a trailing comma on the last entity in array, if it's multi-line. That was kind of silly, and I would miss that regularly. The other one, probably, I don't know what most people would think about it. For me, early on in my development career, I did a ton of cold fusion development. And when you have your functions, whatever, you would reference arguments that came in. Arguments is plural in the cold fusion language because it's a dictionary of multiple values. I can't tell you the amount of times that I typed arguments dot something instead of argument dot something. Because arguments is a dictionary. And so that was just a simple thing, but that was one, just a annoyance, I guess I would say, of constantly like mistyping those. Being able to visualize the changes or the entire modules when you have this many modules that are coupled together in that graph would be super, super useful. And I think it kind of leads to the next thing, I guess, that we want to talk about if there was time, Eric, which was proposals. Seeing more in the UI is, if you're developing, like even your config or developing modules, is incredibly useful to see what is coming from where, or even like what labels exist. There was one time, I want to say that with endpoints, there's here, it's plural endpoints, but when you look for some of these other ones, it's singular. And I can't remember which one of these I was using or whatever, but I had typed it as a singular, and it was driving me crazy why I couldn't figure out why this bit wasn't working. But then from the UI, I was able to start going into like the discovery stages and actually see what was discovered. That's incredibly useful. But I just have a tiny little testing cluster that I'm playing with, and being able to filter, like not render this whole list, and being able to filter on what it exports when it's this gigantic list of things. I mean, if you're in a large Kubernetes cluster, I'm sure you've seen it. If you've used this, it can take forever for like this page to load.
Just hangs. Yeah.
It just hangs, mainly from browser rendering. So if there's a way that I can filter this or like search this without having that whole payload come back, would be great. The Prometheus like scraping components are awesome, because you actually get a little bit more from there that I found very useful. So if I just switched over to here, oh, I picked the wrong one, I think. That was the offense one. I don't know, whatever, for one of these. Being able to go into like a scrape and actually see, so I'm here on this Prometheus, kubelet one. When we view this to see
He's got no targets.
Yeah. Oh, that's why. It's because the tenant that I'm on.
Yeah.
In that case, because it's doing multiple tenants. So where was that? Kubelet here and the script. So being able to see not only like, yes, this is the arguments that came in from relabelings, right? You can see the other, whatever other labels were added. And maybe it's better to look at this for like pods, but ultimately seeing the targets again is very useful to know, okay, these are the labels that were added as part of like service discovery. But it might be better, you know, to see somehow, you know, if there's like the random sample or whatever of metrics, or to be able to put, sometimes I want to be able to put like a trap in of what metrics are being, you know, collected somehow, or just getting more insights in there from the metrics. But for Loki, there wasn't those insights. Like when you start getting into those particular components, there's not a lot of insights there for Loki. Loki does have an echo that just writes to standard out. But if I wanted to hook that into like an existing flow, there would be an existing, you know, inner production application, whatever. Loki echo is not going to do me much good because it's literally going to echo like everything. And so I put a proposal out there to add a selector argument to Loki that I could selectively filter what was getting sent out. But also I think like from the UI, if we were able to do something, you know, within like a Loki.echo as an example, or even the Loki.process that was using like WebSockets and publishing those messages to the WebSocket as well, so you could real time see. I think that would be very beneficial, because when you start doing a bunch of the Loki.processes or enhancing the log line, removing things from the log line, whatever, it can just be very useful to get those insights. And I don't think I showed this earlier. I started going on and we got distracted. So I'm just going to show this where I have my deployment label here, but I am embedding the name of the pod to the end of the log line. So yeah, that could ultimately be structured metadata. I don't know from the structured metadata where all that stands, or like if it's retained or search or whatever that may be. But right now I just throw those to the end of the log line. And if I truly do need to filter on a pod, I can just throw this in there and I am going to get those exact logs from a line filter. If it was a JSON object, I would add a property of __ pod. And that's the behavior of those modules. You know, obviously as Loki is newer versions are released or new features are released, those approaches may change. And the great thing is we'll just change the modules. You know, and I would encourage you, if you're using the public module repository, to include a revision in what you're referencing. That way you do have a consistent type of deployment or release, at least, that you could reference in case the module gets changed. But yeah.
Cool. We are a couple minutes over now. So I did want to kind of give a last call, Aaron, if there's anything else you want to say. But this has been really amazing, I think, for even for the agent team to see, and for everybody to see, you know, how you're using these things in the agent modules repo in practice. There are some other modules in there. I'll short pitch for that. So we like to think of that a little bit as examples of how to use Flow in addition to its modules. So if you're just looking for like some example river stuff, that's a pretty good place to poke around just to get a feel for it. But yeah, Aaron, anything else you want to hit on before we call it for today?
Nope. Hey, you know, if anything comes up or questions about those, obviously, you know, reach out on the Grafana community Slack, and, you know, be happy to jump in, and or if there's an issue, you know, feel free to open an issue there, or even better, contribute your own modules.
Yeah, send us a PR. Always, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
always.
All right.
All
I'm going to pause the recording here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.